So thank you, Hugh. And I'm just reaching over to set my alarm clock for 3:45. So if I nod off during this, you won't have to wait too long before I come back to you. I didn't provide you with an abstract, for which I apologize, but it was just as well because what would have gone into the abstract might not have appeared in the paper because I was COVID excluded from the library this last week. So those things being a complication of all our lives, it's perhaps better not to declare in advance what you intend to do. And my subtitle is a little bit, it sounds a little bit like it will be generally applicable to names. And Hughes said as much just now. I think that's not quite what I'm going to end up doing, because what I want to say about Mariam and about Mary, I'll say Mary for this point of the discussion, is particular and special. I don't think I can apply any of it to textual criticism of the New Testament. But we'll see how we go and see if you think the same. So let me share. Yeah. Let me do this then. Sorry for this delay. Bear with me a second, and I'll
just in case anybody at the virtual SBL was missing the fiddling with the projector and so on at the front of the auditorium each time. I'd like to say that it did work perfectly well for us in practice. There, oh, marvelous. So all we need to do is stare at it for long enough. That looks good, Geoff. Thank you.
Pardon me for that. So I obviously had two versions of it going. Okay. So that's you can still hear me and you can see what I'm displaying, I hope.
Yes, thanks.
So I wanted to comply with the fragments theme, and so talking about Mariam, I found a couple of very fragmentary pieces that are relevant, and they come from Masada, and it's nice to have a chance to just mention Masada because it's been back in the news the last while with the excavation of one or two of these Roman camps that you see here in this picture. Just behind it, the circumvallation, the wall that was built right around Masada. And this is a rather nice view. You don't see the ramp except just the edge of it here. But you do see the profile of the upper and the lower palace. And I quite like that picture. It's dramatic. Just down here, by the way, is where you would walk to reach the lower palace. I say you intentionally because I'm not going to do it again. It's a frightening exercise, and if there was room to actually turn around and go back, I would have turned around and gone back. So you see here the fragment. It's an ostracon, and here's a second one. This one has Mariam written on it, probably. and the editors think, I think it's actually Hannah Cotton doing this, that the name is Mariam and the second name is written in by a second hand. We'll see when we turn the page. But the date's interesting, isn't it? Because we can date these ostraca before 73 CE, spring, or before 74 CE, spring. It's great, isn't it? We have lots of accuracy in determining the date, but only a terminus ad quem, because it's any time really before 73 for dating these. But 73 or 74, because we're not sure quite which year the Romans besieged Masada. And by the way, the latest excavations haven't told us. Oh, so I've got a second page. That's excellent. So there I've just drawn it in so that you can see what the editor thinks is the actual text, Mariam. So that's a case of Mariam being written, presumably somebody's name, round about the time that the New Testament was written. And the commentary is worth reading, so I'm going to read a little bit of it. Sorry. So next to Salome, that is Mariam, is the most popular Jewish female name of the Second Temple period. Mariam is the spelling of the name in the Septuagint, in Philo, elsewhere. The New Testament has both Mariam and Maria, the manuscripts often wavering between the two forms. I want to come back to that expression a bit later. On the other hand, Josephus always writes Mariame with one or two mews, both for the sister of Moses, that is in Numbers 11 in the Septuagint, and for the various Hasmonean and Herodian princesses. Mariame is also the form of the name on the Palestinian papyrus DJG, etc. And we won't talk about that tonight, but you might like to chase it up. It's of great interest. So a comment or two about Josephus before we move on, because we mightn't get back to him. He Hellenizes this name, Mariam. Actually, I'm intrigued by the fact that there are two spellings for it, Mariame, with one mu and one with two. And I wonder whether one of them is not Mariam with may added, and the other is Maria with may added. But I haven't been able to distinguish them consistently in Josephus, and I'm not sure that that's going to work out for me. So a little speculation for what it's worth. Why does Josephus use this form? And intriguingly enough, perhaps to ask the question the other way around, why does that form not turn up anywhere in the New Testament? The New Testament has both Mariam and Maria, declined, one indeclinable, the other declined, but never the form Mariame. The form not only occurs in Josephus, by the way, it's known as, we see here in a papyrus text from the 2nd century, from the Judean desert. And by the way, Josephus himself doesn't always, if we can rely on the manuscripts that we have, always use the form Mariame. I won't retell her story, but some of you will know, and others of you can look it up if you have the stomach for it. The other Mary in Josephus, who was forced to desperate measures by the siege of Jerusalem. Her name is spelled Maria, and perhaps consciously, I'm not sure. I think Josephus is an elitist, and probably we're talking about something to do with class. And particularly, it's interesting that he's usually using these long forms Mariam of the princesses of the palace, Herodian ones, but Hasmonean ones as well. But intriguingly enough, then when he mentions the sister of Moses, he also uses the form Mariam, which we don't see in any Septuagint manuscript. Well, we see where we get with that, but I mention, because it'll come up later, Marcus as well. People often say, I've seen it written and I've heard it said quite a few times, that Josephus demonstrates that Marcus was a common Jewish name, because it occurs quite commonly in Josephus. Interestingly enough, I think Josephus uses Marcus roughly 7 times. 6 of those people are Roman senators. So that again illustrates the privilege that attaches to Josephus, and I suspect makes us think about his use of names and the people he knew as well in a different way. So our author says that the New Testament wavers in its use of Mariam and Maria. It's an interesting question, by the way, before we get onto the specifics of the textual criticism, to ask why Mary was such a popular name. All the women in the New Testament seem to be called Mary. There may be, and I'm going to speculate here a little bit, some reasons for this that might justify it. Women weren't commonly named. And so it's perhaps possible that because the mother of Jesus was called Mary, all the other Marys are justified being named as well. Don't think that one is very strong. Perhaps the common use was inspired by Miriam, from the Septuagint, the sister of Moses, but she gets a bad press. And so it's hard to think that the name would have become popular if Miriam were the inspiration for it. And it isn't really, I don't think, a Greek name. I'll say later that I think it's a Latin name, but I don't think it's a Greek name. So I can't answer that question either, but I think it's an interesting one. So I wonder whether this is a text critical question at all. And so a little bit of evidence and some analysis to inspire our thinking about this. Maybe these are just Maria and Mariam, are just 2 variant spellings of the same name. And scribes hardly noticed the difference between them, and perhaps New Testament authors hardly noticed the difference between them. And they randomly chose one or the other, copied one or the other, didn't notice any difference. I guess that would make it a text critical question anyway, but one that we can't possibly answer. But I'm not sure that it's true. But there's something more going on, even so, if we're to turn this into a text critical problem. So in particular, scholars have noticed the difference in consistency as far as New Testament manuscripts are concerned. We don't have much consistency within a manuscript, particular individual manuscripts. Perhaps P66 is exceptional in this regard, and Keith, I hope, is going to help us with that later. But if it is consistent, most aren't. We don't have consistency within text type. And you get this a little bit, I think you might be able to read it, but I can read it out for you. So this is the first, that first is Moulton and Howard. So 1920, Howard's writing, and he says, in the genitive, Maria stands virtually without variation, according to Westcott and Hort, for all the women so named. And he gives away two of the ways in which we've tried to get sense out of the many different forms and behaviors of the text for this name. On one view, there's a distinction made between the women. Mary is always called Mariam. The other women are then called Maria. Not consistently, but perhaps it's true that you can start to see that pattern. And there's a distinction in case. So nominative, vocative, accusative, dative, yes, but the genitive never appears as Mariam, so it's claimed. So there seems to be a difference in case as well, and perhaps that allows us to discover the pattern. But at least Howard didn't think so, because he goes on to say, the mother of Jesus, Westcott and Hort, always give as Mariam, except in these two cases. And you see the way the text diverges there. And if we chose specially, he says, we could make that rule absolute, but really doesn't work for us. They make the same rule for Mary of Bethany, that is Westcott and Hort do, though here they are content with once with 33 as sole authority. So you start to see how the individual manuscripts and within the manuscripts and whatever families might exist and whatever else is going on in this text, or these texts, consistency and a pattern of usage doesn't seem to emerge. So they have an interesting terminology here. Oh, by the way, they don't mention the possibility that different New Testament authors might treat the name differently. So you might imagine, for example, that Luke would be more likely to Hellenize the name. At least as the manuscript, as far as the manuscripts are concerned, turns out that he seems to be less likely to do so. In Acts, at least in Acts 1, where Mary, the mother of Jesus, is present with the disciples after the resurrection at the birth of the church. So for whatever reason, perhaps it's textual, he doesn't do what we might imagine him to do. So Howard says, he uses these terms, he says, this usage is inexplicable. He says, only 2 or 3 manuscripts are consistent. He says, a rule seems unattainable. He basically says, this name is a textual mess. Now, that's 1920. So we better bring ourselves up to date a little bit. And so I also provide you here with an extract from Blas, de Bruyne, and Rakoff, the 14th edition, 1975. I would have given you the English if I had it, but I don't have it. So I'm afraid I've given you the German, but look at it for a moment. And he says an interesting thing at the bottom. Ob mit Maria eine Hellenisierung vorliegt, ist nunmehr unsicher mit Bezug auf die Form Maria, we'll say it, in den Inschriften von Jerusalem. So the argument's moved on a little bit since Howard. We haven't got any pattern according to, let's guess it's Rakoff. but we have a little bit of additional evidence, but it's not helping us a lot. So now I get to talk about the versions a little bit, and we get closer to the Latin. But I've given you just a brief extract from the Hatch and Redpath Concordance. You'll see that Mariam is the normal form in the Septuagint. And there's an interesting little line there where he notes that the Old Latin manuscript that we have of Numbers also has Maria and not Mariam. So, by the way, does the Vulgate everywhere throughout. I've had a search with help from my colleague Simone Rickaby, who's on the call and might correct me any moment. And we've searched everywhere we could in the Vetus Latina, Old Testament, New Testament, all the quotations that we could get a handle on. We haven't found a single case of Mariam which isn't an accusative. So I just don't think they exist, but I've given you an extract there from the monumenta.ch. For those of you whose Latin is better than mine, you can rip through that while I'm finishing this page and see if you can spot an occurrence of Mariam that isn't an accusative. I've highlighted them to help you. So a little bit about the other versions then. So the Syriac is interesting because Maria is very common in Syriac, as you may know. But the name is always spelt Mariam without exception. And Maria, of course, means Lord. So it's going to have trouble being a proper noun. So it's not surprising that the Syriac doesn't make the distinction for us. And so it's evidence for whether the original text read Maria or Mariam falls away. The Arabic's a bit the same, Mariam. Of course, that's a very common modern Arabic name. You hear it on the street all the time. It's not surprising that Maria then doesn't turn up in any Arabic manuscripts without further comment on those manuscripts and their significance at all. And interesting enough, the Georgian and the Armenian both have declinable and indeclinable forms of these nouns. I don't think the texts are so reliable that we can use them most of the time for textual criticism to distinguish Maria from Mariam, but it would be nice if we could. So I make my conclusion there. Mariam occurs all over the place, but it's the accusative rather than ever the nominative or any other case. So there, I've played a game with my name. I thought you might like that, a little bit like Maria May and Maria. I don't think, by the way, that Geoff spelt with a J and Geoff spelt with a G have anything like the same cadence, but I don't think there's a Geoff with a J on the call, is there? There was last time round, and that Geoff told me that he preferred my spelling, and I told him that I did too. So here's the conclusion, and I'm going to conclude with some speculation. I think this is a bit of fun. I'm reminded that I haven't spoken about P66, but I'm sure that Keith's going to help us with that in a little while, so I don't need to. Dictionaries are, well, I don't think they're definitive. I like to say dictionaries are definitional rather than definitive. And here's a nice example. This is Bauer, Ireland, the edition, the 6th edition done by Kurt and Barbara, 1988 at the top. And underneath it, Bauer called, perhaps a little implausibly in English, Bauer Arndt Gingrich. It's based on the 4th edition, 1952. The English was done in 1957, just to make sure that we've got our dates roughly right. Look at the German for a minute, and you notice that the definition of that is, if you like, a translation of the noun, Mariam. If we could see the top of the entry, we'd see that they've just lumped together Mariam and Maria in any case. Maria, they call these people. This is number 6 and 7, so we're at the end of the entry in both cases. And you see that number 6 refers to Mary, the mother of John Mark, heard from in Acts 12:12. I haven't time to compare those two entries and point out the differences between them, but there are a few. But let's concentrate on 7 because it gives me a chance to finish with my speculation. Mary, it says in English, an otherwise unknown Christian, certainly of Jewish descent, which compares interestingly with Name einer sonst unbekannten Christen, wohl Juden Christen. Probably, it says, a Jewish Christian. And then it adds a most intriguing note. Doch erscheint, so, however, it appears that Maria, according to Ramsey's quotations, is a feminine form of the Roman name Marius. Marius, he, Maria, she. And those of you who read a lot of Latin will always think of that when you see Maria, I'm sure. Notice one other thing before we leave this and come to a conclusion. In the English, there's a reference to the variant reading here, Mariam, because here's another case in Romans 16 where we get both Maria in the accusative and Mariam in the accusative too, but in declinable. And he writes, as early as P46, he's surprised how early the name Mariam intrudes. If that's what he means, I think he's got it a bit backward. I suspect, my own view would be, for the start of an argument, that all of the New Testament writers wrote Mariam for all of the Marys in all of the cases. And that's where I'd start and go from there. But let me pick up as my last comment on the importance of that Maria as the feminine form of Marius. I don't know that it's the Mary in Rome that we should be looking for here. It's the other Mary in Jerusalem, Acts 12:12, the mother of Marcus, Maria et Marcus, whose servant, bilingual or trilingual servant, Rhoda, I think, was the person who ghost wrote the first gospel.
Thank you then, Geoff. And I think there's plenty of textual criticism for us to get our teeth into with that. people who have been people who have been working on this in New Testament studies recently will be familiar with the work of Elizabeth Schrader, who has looked particularly at the women in John 11, and she was here on the call and has had to dash off, but has left me her question in chat, so I can start while others are thinking of the questions they want to ask, by asking on her behalf the extent to which you have been able to investigate name variants in Coptic, so in Nag Hammadi documents, and then also whether you're familiar with Deirdre Good's piece on the topic, the Miriamic secret.
The answer to the second one is no, but I'll become so as soon as the library opens for me. But I left out the Ethiopic and the Coptic, and I did so because it adds as much complication as is already there, virtually doubles it. So it would have been a session in its own right, but definitely deserves to be done. Not only, I think, because it opens up that question of whether there is evidence to decide between Maria and Mariam in the New Testament text itself, from place to place, but it also opens up the question of whether the name Mary had an early Christian usage. It doesn't seem to have had much of a one, at least in Greek.
So there's a comment on Codex, I assume, yes, no, 05, that's Codex Bezae.
Yes, and Bezae is an obvious place to go, isn't it? Because it's got both the Greek and the Latin. And occasionally you get Mariam in the Greek, but very rarely. Richard, would you speak a little more to that? Richard's on the call, is he?
Sure. Yeah, just to say, I noticed that Maria does dominate. I think at the beginning there's a Mariam, and then it switches, and then stays consistently after that for Mary.
Yes, that matches my observations. An anti-Judaic tendency is an interesting suggestion, isn't it? Because if there's a distinctively Jewish flavor to Mariam, then one might imagine that that could potentially influence scribes if they had something else to go to. It'll further complicate the argument usefully.
So I'm not seeing any other questions being raised. So if you have got your video on, wave enthusiastically. Oh, Paul, over to you.
Not so much a question. You made, I think, the suggestion, or you rejected the suggestion that the prevalence of the name Miriam was picking up on Moses' sister. I wonder if you had a chance, and maybe this is another for when you get back in the library. The Jewish scholar Tal Alan has an excellent 4-volume work, A Lexicon of Jewish Names. And what she shows, I think, is there are nearly 10 times more male names recorded, both in inscriptions and literature, I think down to about the 4th century, than male names, but more than half of the female names recorded are Miriam, if I remember. It's either a quarter or a half, but it's hugely disproportionate. So what we see in the New Testament, with the preponderance of Marys or Miriams, is mirrored in Jewish inscriptions and literature of the time. And, you know, I think it is reflecting the status of Miriam, who leads the the children of Israel dancing in joy and is seen as one of the prominent figures. So it might be worth a look at that. I think it's a lot of raw data. Much of it is obviously in Aramaic rather than Greek, but some of the inscriptions are in Greek as well. So just a thought to enrich your discussion even further.
And that's very helpful. And there's a copy in Sydney. So when I can cross the border, I will fill in those gaps. Hugh, can I just ask for if Carla could speak to her question for a second?
Yes, I mean, Carla was observing that in Gothic we have two forms, but Carla, if you'd like to unmute, you're very welcome to tell us more.
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting. It's so curious. In Gothic, we have two forms, and we don't know why. And the pronunciation should be very similar. This is very curious. And no explication, no explanation. So it was just a note, not a question.
Are they both declinable, Carla, or have I asked a silly question?
Sorry?
Are they both declinable, the names?
Yes, yes.
Well, if I draw together our final, oh, I'm just going to say, Joey's coming in. Over to you then, Joey.
Thank you for that talk. I know you mentioned in the talk that in the Septuagint, Mariam is used pretty consistently. I mean, you may be familiar with, I think, the question of why Luke in his gospel occasionally seems to switch to language or a style that imitates the Septuagint. Have you considered if there's any overlap between where he does that and where he uses Miriam instead of Maria?
I've certainly tried to do that, tried to have an eye on that question when reading Acts, but there's only two occurrences in Acts, and so the argument goes away. But it's you draw attention to the relationship between the two, and it's intriguing that there's none of this textual diversity in the Septuagint. I must say, when I first started reading this, I thought, oh, well, the Septuagint manuscripts written by the same Christians will show the same tendency. It doesn't happen for whatever reason. Whatever's going on here, that's not a part of the explanation. I'm reading the notes, Hugh. You're perhaps reading them too. James's comments, very interesting.
Well, we have conversations going at all levels. I think given the time at the minute, I'll stop the formal business here and remind everybody that next week we have papers from David Flood in Edinburgh on new readings in manuscript 1506 and Dwayne McCrawley on the Arabic text of Romans in Sinai Greek New Finds Majuscule 2. So we will be focusing on manuscripts aplenty next week, and thank you for joining us this week.